Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
You ever been in a room where every smile feels rehearsed, like people are performing a family-friendly play, but behind the curtains it's all chaos, betrayal, and duct-taped secrets? That was my family brunch the Sunday before my brother's engagement party, sun shining, mimosas flowing, and mom's silver serving trays polished so hard they reflected your soul. The dining room looked like something out of a Better Homes and Gardens magazine, but the air? Thick. Fake. Heavy with the kind of tension you only notice when you're not pretending like everyone else. I remember it exactly. I was in the kitchen, scraping burnt egg off a nonstick pan, because yes, my life is that glamorous, when I overheard Madison whispering to my mom about something I wasn't supposed to hear. It wasn't even juicy at first, just one of those low, strategic conversations where every word is too careful, too calculated. But then Madison said, "I know Hannah used to be married to him." I just thought it was in the past. And Mom, my own mother, who once cried because I pierced my ear without her permission, answered without missing a beat, "It is." And she's not to bring it up. We want this day to be perfect. Now, I'm not a genius, but even I can connect those dots. Especially when the him she mentioned was my ex-husband, Jeremy. And Madison, my brother's bright-eyed, endlessly curated fiancé, just so happened to have a history with him. A shared past that somehow included me, and yet I was the only one not informed. I stood there, hands still wet, pan half-washed, trying to decide whether I was losing my mind or just living in someone else's joke. When I walked back into the dining room, Madison gave me a smile like I'd missed the punchline. Her eyes met mine across the table, and I swear to God, she winked. Now, look, I'm not the jealous type. I got divorced 3 years ago and haven't looked back since. Jeremy was charming on the surface, but underneath he was one of those men who collected secrets like baseball cards, flirting with interns, hiding phone bills, gaslighting me into thinking I was crazy when he was the one doing dirt. So when I got out, I stayed out. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look back. But I also didn't expect him to somehow circle back into my life by way of Madison. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a classmate. Maybe a short-lived college fling. People date. People forget. Maybe she didn't even know who I was back then. But that theory fell apart 2 hours later when I went upstairs to get my purse from the guest room and found hers half open on the bed. And no, I didn't go rifling through it like some kind of amateur sleuth. I wasn't looking for dirt. But what caught my eye was a photo sticking out of a notebook, and on that photo, clear as daylight, was Jeremy. Standing next to Madison. His arm around her waist like he'd done with me 1,000 times. They were younger, sure, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but it was him. And it was definitely her. And behind them? My old apartment door. So no, this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a "we met once at a coffee shop" story. Madison had been to my home, had stood on my porch, and had smiled next to my then-husband like she'd belonged there. My blood went cold. I took a breath, slid the photo back in place, and left without saying a word. But in my chest, something snapped. That night, I called Mom. I told her everything I'd seen. Her reaction? Ice cold. "Hannah, don't start drama where there isn't any. Liam finally found someone who loves him, and I won't have you sabotaging this." Sabotaging. That's what she called it. Like I was trying to ruin Christmas morning because I didn't like the wrapping paper. I reminded her that Madison was standing in my house next to my husband. That this wasn't ancient history, it was deeply personal. Mom paused, sighed like I was exhausting her, and said something that still makes my skin crawl. "This isn't about you anymore. You need to sit this one out." And just like that, I was benched from my own family. Relegated to the peanut gallery while my brother celebrated the biggest day of his life with a woman who, at best, had lied about her past and, at worst, had deliberately wormed her way into our family for reasons I couldn't yet name. I stared at my phone for a full minute after that call, half waiting for Mom to call back and say something like, "You're right. I overreacted. We need to talk." But she didn't. She didn't call. She didn't text. She just moved on like none of it mattered. The next morning, I did what any rational adult woman would do. I stalked Madison's socials like a damn hawk. Everything was perfect. Filtered. Glossy. There was a post from 3 years ago captioned "Grateful for closed doors and open hearts," tagged in my neighborhood. Another one 6 months later with Jeremy cropped out, but his dog's leash still visible in her hand. She'd erased him from her digital timeline, but not from the truth. Not from me. And the more I scrolled, the more the question clawed at me. Was Madison just another one of Jeremy's forgettable conquests? Or was she something else? Someone calculated, strategic? Because if she knew who I was all along, and let's be honest, the odds of her not knowing are zero, then this wasn't a coincidence. It was a move. A bold one. And that terrified me in a way I didn't expect. But I stayed quiet. For my brother. For Liam, who had never had anything nice for more than a few minutes. Who always got hand-me-downs, the broken Christmas toys, the last slice of pie after Dad and Uncle Ray picked through the good pieces. He finally had someone who chose him. Who wanted him. And even if that someone was a spider in lipstick, I didn't want to be the one to stomp the illusion. So I sat back. I smiled. I agreed to help with the engagement decorations. I kept the peace. Because that's what you do when your mom asks you to shut up and your brother is too in love to see anything outside his own bubble. But the more I watched Madison, the more I noticed how careful she was, how her compliments always sounded like tests, how her kindness had sharp corners, how every interaction felt like she was memorizing us for later. And then, 3 nights before the party, she pulled me aside while we were setting up centerpieces and said something so strange I still don't fully understand it. She leaned in, right near my ear, and whispered, "Funny how everything comes full circle, isn't it?" Then she walked away, humming. I stood there frozen, holding a bunch of white peonies, suddenly wondering if this wasn't just a coincidence, or even a game. Maybe it was a message. And I had no idea who else already knew. There's a particular kind of silence that follows you when you're forced to keep a secret no one asked you to carry, a silence that doesn't just live in your throat, but settles into your shoulders, makes your back ache. Makes you second-guess every word that almost leaves your lips. That week leading up to the engagement party, I carried that silence like a stone in my stomach, unable to sleep, barely eating. Smiling through clenched teeth while my mother chirped on about color palettes and seating arrangements like nothing in the world was even slightly off-kilter. Madison, meanwhile, floated through the house like some kind of curated hallucination, always helpful, always upbeat, always just a little too attentive, like she was studying us, learning the rhythm of our family so she could sink her own chaos right into the beat. And I kept asking myself over and over again, was I imagining it? Was I projecting? Had I, in some twisted, unresolved corner of my brain, latched onto this girl as a scapegoat for my own failed marriage, for the debris Jeremy left behind when he walked out of our lives without a backward glance? I wanted to believe that. I really honestly did. Because the alternative, that Madison knew exactly who I was, who Liam was, who Jeremy had been to both of us, and that she'd still walked in with her teeth bared in a smile, was almost too heavy to wrap my mind around. But it got harder to pretend when the universe started handing me breadcrumbs. Subtle ones, quiet ones, the kind you could almost brush off as coincidence, unless you were already looking, already listening. It started on Wednesday afternoon, when I ran into Becca Fisher at the florist. Becca and I weren't close anymore, but we'd gone to college together, had a few messy nights, and shared the kind of friendship that doesn't survive marriage and jobs and babies, but still sparks a kind of familiar warmth when you see each other unexpectedly. She was holding a bouquet of yellow tulips, wearing that look that women wear when they want to say something but aren't sure if they're allowed. "Hannah," she said, tilting her head the way people do when they're trying to place you in a timeline. "Oh my God, are you still with Jeremy?" It felt like someone had poured cold water down my back. I laughed, politely, the way you do when someone touches an old bruise. "No, divorced 3 years now." "Why?" Becca blinked. "Huh. Funny. I thought he was engaged to that girl. What was her name?" "Madison." The tulips might as well have hit the floor. I blinked. "Engaged." She shrugged. "Well, I mean, they were pretty serious for a while. That's what someone told me, at least." I saw them at a fundraiser a couple years ago, and they looked like, the real deal. The real deal. That phrase clanged around in my head like a dropped fork in an empty room. Because whatever Madison was to my brother now, she had apparently already played the role of real deal once before, with my ex-husband, no less. And if that wasn't enough to boil your blood, she was playing it again, this time in my own family, with Liam, who still thought she was some angel plucked out of a Hallmark movie, a soft-spoken girl who loved puzzles and red wine and long hikes in the fall. I thanked Becca, pretended I wasn't dying inside, and drove home with shaking hands, the tulips forgotten in the back seat, the steering wheel slick with sweat. Every piece was falling into place, but not in any way that made sense. Just fragments, memories, facial expressions, things said too slowly or too perfectly. Madison had dated Jeremy. Not casually. Not briefly. She'd been his girlfriend long enough for it to register with people we knew. She'd walked into my life once before, and now she was doing it again, this time through the front door, with my mother's blessing and a ring on her finger. That night, I went to my mom's house again, not to argue, but to try, just once more, to explain that something wasn't right. That this wasn't just me being dramatic. That Madison was lying. But I didn't even get 3 sentences out before Mom was already rolling her eyes, already muttering about how exhausting I was being, how I couldn't stand it when someone else was in the spotlight. She poured herself another glass of wine and said, "You're going to ruin this for him, Hannah. You know that, right?" And for a moment, I wondered if she actually saw me at all, if she ever had, or if I'd always just been a vessel for disappointment, a woman who got married too young, divorced too fast, and now lived in the shadow of every carefully crafted image my mother put in her Christmas newsletters. I left that house feeling like a ghost in my own family. But even ghosts remember things. 2 nights before the party, we had a small rehearsal dinner in my parents' backyard, just close friends and family, a dry run for the big night. Madison wore a sage green dress that matched the napkins and brought handmade gift bags for the bridesmaids. Everyone praised her thoughtfulness. Everyone drank her curated cocktails and posed for her Polaroids and listened to her laugh like it was music. But when she passed by me, she paused barely for a second, and in a voice that no one else could hear, she said, "Still holding on to old things, Hannah? That's not healthy." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even breathe. Because in that moment, I knew, without a shred of doubt, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a woman caught in a coincidence. Madison knew exactly who I was, what Jeremy had meant to me, how much of myself I'd lost in that marriage, and how hard I'd fought to build a new version of my life without dragging the past behind me like a bag of broken glass. And now she was here, backlit by fairy lights, smirking into her wine glass, toasting to her future like the past had never happened. But here's the thing. People like Madison always make one mistake. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They think if they play nice, smile sweet, and deliver the occasional backhanded whisper, no one will fight back. They think the past is a tool only they get to use. So I decided something right then and there. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I wasn't going to yell or demand answers or out her in front of everyone like some deranged wedding crasher. No, I was going to wait. I was going to watch. And when the moment came, the right moment, I would do what she never expected. I would speak. And this time, everyone would hear me. The night of the engagement party arrived draped in the kind of artificial charm that only people who've never lived through a real crisis can fully appreciate. The rented fairy lights twinkled like 4 stars. The lawn had been trimmed within an inch of its life. The tables were dressed in fine linens that smelled faintly of mothballs and overcompensation, and every guest arrived with smiles so wide and eyes so blank they could have been extras in a soap opera. And yet, beneath that perfectly powdered surface, just below the scripted laughter and champagne flutes clinking too loudly, there was a current, something dark, something sharp. Something unspoken that vibrated under every interaction like feedback from a mic nobody wanted to admit was on. I wore navy, not because it was flattering, but because it was neutral, non-threatening, forgettable background. I didn't want to draw attention. I didn't want questions. I just wanted to be close enough to watch Madison operate, to see how far she was willing to push her performance, and to figure out what, if anything, I could still do to stop the slow-motion train wreck my brother was apparently sprinting toward with his eyes closed and arms wide open. From the moment she arrived, arm in arm with Liam like a page out of a bridal magazine, Madison played the room with an ease that was almost admirable. She greeted my great-aunt by name, even though they'd only met once in passing at a Thanksgiving years ago. She laughed at Uncle Ray's borderline inappropriate jokes without so much as a flinch. She remembered the florist's kid had a peanut allergy and offered up a separate dessert plate without being asked. And for a second, just one slippery, disorienting second, I almost believed that maybe I was wrong, that maybe this woman really had buried her past, that Jeremy was just a blip, an accident, a faded photo in a forgotten notebook. But then she looked at me across the buffet table, while sipping rose like it was oxygen, and gave me a smile so tight, so deliberately stretched across her face, that I could feel the insult behind it before she even opened her mouth. "I'm so glad you came, Hannah," she said, voice low, eyes glassy. "Family means everything to me." I bit into a too-dry canopy and nodded, pretending not to notice the cold sweat crawling down my spine. Because it wasn't the words that got me, it was the way she said them, the deliberate weight she gave to the word family, as though daring me to define what that meant, as though testing whether I would crack and say something that might finally pull the mask off for good. But I didn't crack. I waited. Because I knew the toast was coming. It was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the point in the night where everyone would be called to attention, glasses raised, eyes shining with the wine of false hope, and someone, probably Liam, would say a few soft-hearted words about love and commitment and how lucky he was to have found someone who truly saw him. And I could live with that. I could stomach the bland sweetness of it, the blind sincerity. What I wasn't ready for, what I hadn't anticipated in my many sleepless mental rehearsals, was that Madison, glowing and tipsy and just a touch too loose-lipped, would ask to speak first. She didn't even wait for the coordinator to gather everyone. She clinked her fork against her glass and stood, barely wobbling, in heels too expensive for grass. The backyard hushed like someone had sucked the air out of it. And then, in that silence, she smiled wide, warm, wolfish. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, in that sing-songy voice women use when they've absolutely been planning to say something for weeks, but I feel like I'd regret not taking this chance to really speak from the heart. I watched Liam's expression soften with affection, the way it always did around her, like a dog who'd been kicked enough times to think any touch was kindness. He reached for her hand, but she didn't take it. Her eyes stayed fixed somewhere between me and the tree line. "I've been in love before," she said, and instantly, the crowd did that collective polite shift people do when things get too personal too fast. Not the kind that lasts, obviously. Not the kind that feels good, or right, or even healthy, if I'm being honest. My chest tightened. My fingers curled around my glass until the condensation soaked through the napkin. "But love teaches us," she continued, voice louder now, even the worst kinds. "Sometimes we have to get completely broken down before we realize what we deserve. And sometimes life gives you a second chance, not with the same person, of course, but with someone who reminds you that you're still worthy of good things." Liam blinked. The corners of his mouth twitched, unsure whether to smile or panic. "I used to think love was control," she said, and now her eyes were on me, full and unflinching. "Manipulation. Obsession. I thought it was about surviving someone else's moods, earning their affection like a prize. But that wasn't love. That was just punishment disguised as romance. And I let it happen. I let it happen for years." A cold rush crawled up my back like fingers made of ice. The silence after that was unbearable, more than polite now, more than stunned. People were listening, really listening, and I could see it landing on them in waves, each person absorbing her words in their own twisted, personal way. Liam's face had gone pale. Not confused. Not sad. Just hollow. As if someone had reached into him and scooped out everything soft and hopeful. And Madison? She ended her toast with a casual sip of wine, a smile so fragile it might have passed for sincere, and the words, "So here's to new chapters, and to the kind of love that doesn't come with a receipt." The moment the last syllable left her lips, she turned to kiss Liam's cheek, but he was already backing away, just slightly, just enough for it to register as wrong. And the guests? They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just stared. Eyes wide. Mouths tight. No one knew what had just happened, but they all felt the seismic shift of it, like the ground had tilted and nobody could find their footing. Liam muttered something, I couldn't hear what, and then he left. Just turned and walked off toward the back gate, past the table of monogrammed cupcakes and the rented heaters and the photo booth filled with props no one wanted to use anymore. I followed him without thinking, without permission, without anything but the certainty that whatever just cracked open couldn't be ignored. And behind me, as I moved through that stunned crowd, I saw Madison watching us, one corner of her mouth turned up, not quite a smile, but something colder. Something final. Because whatever this night was supposed to be, whatever celebration we'd all been roped into, it was no longer about love. It was a reckoning. And she had just thrown the first match. The walk to the back of the garden felt longer than it was, not because the space was large, it wasn't. It was just your typical suburban backyard dressed up to resemble something elegant and effortless. But because every step I took was heavy with the weight of everything I had swallowed for the past week, for the past month, for maybe even the past 3 years, and now that it was finally spilling over, now that the illusion had cracked wide open for everyone to see. I didn't know whether I was chasing my brother out of concern or guilt, or maybe some tangled mess of both. Liam stood just beyond the arbor, his back turned to the house, hands braced against the edge of the low wooden fence like he needed something solid to keep him from floating off into some emotional void he couldn't quite name yet, and the sight of him like that, slumped, fragile, visibly unraveling, did something sharp and specific to my chest, because I had seen that posture before, not in him, but in myself, during the quiet hours after Jeremy left, when the house echoed with questions I hadn't yet dared to say out loud. I opened my mouth to say his name, but he beat me to it, his voice low, hoarse, like he'd swallowed a mouthful of ash, and didn't know what to do with the bitterness. How long have you known? He asked, not turning around, not softening the edges, just straight to the point in a way that made my stomach twist, because there it was. The accusation that had been creeping toward me since the moment Madison raised her glass and started pulling apart her story in front of everyone. I told myself to be careful, to tread lightly, to say only what needed to be said, but instead, I answered with a truth I hadn't quite admitted until that moment. I found out last week, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. At brunch. I overheard something, then I saw a photo. I put it together. He turned then, slowly, his expression unreadable in the dimming light, though his eyes, always so easy to read as a kid, always wide and open and too trusting, were shadowed now, dulled by the realization that the people closest to him had been keeping things from him, pretending while he celebrated, laughing at jokes that suddenly felt like mockery in hindsight. You found out, and you didn't say anything, he repeated, like he couldn't quite believe it, like he needed to hear it out loud again just to be sure it was real. I wanted to say that I'd tried, that I had gone to our mother, that I had warned her, that I'd been told to keep the peace, to let it go, that everyone around me had chosen denial over discomfort. But even as the words formed in my mind, I knew they wouldn't matter. Not to him. Because in the end, he wasn't asking if I'd tried, he was asking why I hadn't chosen him, why I hadn't trusted him to handle the truth. And the answer, awful as it sounded, was simple. I hadn't thought he could. I didn't want to hurt you, I said, and it sounded pathetic even to me, like something people say when they want to avoid admitting their own cowardice. Liam gave a short, humorless laugh and looked away again, toward the rows of fairy lights now flickering on automatically, casting the yard in soft, artificial glow that made everything look warmer than it felt. So instead you let her do it? You just stood there and waited for the show. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Because the truth was I had waited. I'd watched Madison maneuver her way through our lives with the skill of someone who had played this game before and knew exactly which cards to hold and which to throw down at just the right moment. And part of me, the part still quietly seething from my own wreckage with Jeremy, had wanted her to expose herself, had wanted her to be the one to pull the pin from the grenade she had carried into our family with a smile on her face and a diamond on her finger. Liam rubbed his face with both hands, like he was trying to wipe away the whole night, and when he looked at me again, there was something tired in his gaze, something older than he should have carried. She dated him, he said slowly. She dated Jeremy. For how long? Years, I said, softly, the word landing between us like a weight dropped from a rooftop. It wasn't just a fling. It was serious. Long enough for people to assume they'd get engaged. He shook his head, his jaw tight, and I could see the math happening in real time. Years with Jeremy, which overlapped with my marriage, which meant Madison had likely been around, lurking, circling, pretending, while I was still fighting to make that miserable union work. So she knew, he said, and this time it wasn't a question. She knew you were his wife. And she just kept going. Right into my life. Right into this. I nodded. I didn't try to cushion it. There was no point anymore. There was a long pause then, the kind that stretches time and tests patience, where neither of us knew what to say or do, and for a brief second, I thought he might cry. But he didn't. He just breathed, long and slow, like someone coming up from a deep dive, realizing only now how little air he'd been getting. I need to ask you something, he said finally, quieter than before. Do you think she planned this? Coming into my life? Do you think she did it to, what? Get back at you? Or him? It was a question I had been circling for days, and I still didn't have an answer that didn't sound paranoid or cruel. But there had been too many coincidences, too many perfectly placed details, and the way she had looked at me smug and unafraid spoke of someone who wasn't caught off guard, but in control. I don't know, I admitted, and this time, the honesty felt cleaner. But I think she liked the idea of walking into my family and rewriting the ending to her story. Liam nodded once, slowly, then stepped away from the fence, straightening his spine like he'd just remembered he still had to be strong, still had to smile in photos, still had to finish this night without crumbling in front of people who didn't deserve the truth. Well, he said, she got what she wanted. Now the whole damn room knows she's been broken before. I just didn't realize she wanted to break me too. I didn't follow him when he walked away. There was nothing else to say. But later that night, after the guests had mostly left and the cleanup had begun, I wandered back inside and found a half-buried box in the hall closet, a dusty photo album my mother used to keep of all the family holidays, now forgotten beneath stacks of seasonal table runners and never-used linens. I flipped through it slowly, not sure what I was looking for, until I landed on a photo from 8 years ago. Thanksgiving. Me and Jeremy on the porch. And in the background, half hidden, half smiling, Madison. Not just in the frame. In the house. And then I understood. She hadn't just followed him. She had studied us. And my brother was never the target. He was just the last step. The morning after the engagement party, the air felt too still, too expectant, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say the thing everyone else was too afraid to say out loud. There was this strange tension that hovered over every room like fog, thick, heavy, almost visible, and every member of the family seemed to float through it with forced politeness and brittle smiles that cracked at the edges the moment no one was watching. My mother, of course, kept herself busy with the performative chaos of post-event cleanup, folding napkins with unnecessary precision, organizing leftover party favors into neat little bags no one had asked for, and humming a melody so strained and repetitive that it bordered on unnerving. Liam hadn't come downstairs yet. Madison was, inexplicably, still there, still smiling, still offering help with dishes and asking where she could find extra garbage bags, as if she hadn't set fire to the whole damn family the night before with her champagne-soaked confession. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching her slice fruit into 2 perfect wedges, and I wondered how someone like her could function with so much ease after detonating a social grenade in the middle of her own celebration. She looked serene, unbothered, like everything had gone exactly to plan, which, by that point, I was almost certain it had. And if that was true, if every calculated pause, every syrupy compliment, every carefully dropped word about broken love and second chances had been part of her design, then what the hell was she waiting for now? Because no one survives a game like that without a final move. By the time the remaining guests arrived for brunch, mostly family, a few persistent friends, and a couple of Liam's coworkers who clearly hadn't gotten the memo that everything had gone sideways. Everyone had settled into that particular kind of awkward small talk people use when they don't want to admit something terrible happened. The weather was mentioned. Flights were discussed. Someone asked if the mini quiches were gluten-free. No one brought up the toast. No one mentioned the way Liam disappeared halfway through the night, or how Madison hadn't looked even slightly surprised by it. No one asked the obvious questions because they were all waiting for someone else to ask first. So I decided to ask. Not directly. Not with a raised voice or a trembling finger. But in the same way Madison had, the night before, quietly, strategically, under the guise of civility. I waited until most of the group had gathered in the living room, sipping lukewarm coffee and picking at fruit platters, and then I stood up, glass in hand, and tapped it gently with my fingernail, not enough to demand attention, just enough to signal that something was coming. I wasn't planning to say anything, I began, echoing her words from the night before so deliberately that even she tilted her head slightly, recognizing the mirror. But I think after last night, there's a little more to be said about love, about family, about what we carry with us when we try to start over. People shifted. Eyes turned. Someone coughed into their hand. I took a breath, steady, measured, letting my voice travel just enough to reach the far corners of the room without ever sounding like I was trying to make a scene. I've been thinking a lot about the past, I said, my gaze drifting slowly toward Madison, who still hadn't blinked. About how sometimes it doesn't stay in the past, no matter how tightly we try to box it up and bury it beneath something shinier. Sometimes, the past sits in the front row of your life, smiling, nodding, waiting for you to notice. There were murmurs then, light, confused, uncertain, but I pressed forward, letting each word settle like dust on glass. When I first met Madison, I continued, I thought she was a stranger. But I was wrong. She wasn't new. She was familiar. Deeply familiar. The kind of familiar that takes a while to recognize because it's been wearing a different face. The silence after that was the kind that pulled people into it, that left no room for distraction or deflection. Even my mother had stopped moving, frozen mid-motion, a folded napkin still clutched in her hand like she was bracing for an impact that was now inevitable. I found a photo the other night, I said, and now my eyes were fixed on Madison, steady and unwavering. Thanksgiving. 8 years ago. Jeremy and I on the porch. And there, in the background, just barely visible, Madison. Not a guest. Not a friend of a friend. Just there. Gasps are rare in real life. They're more dramatic in movies, more exaggerated. But what I heard wasn't a gasp, it was a quiet unraveling. A subtle exhale of understanding from people who, until that moment, had been trying desperately not to connect the dots. She knew me, I said simply. She knew my marriage. She knew my husband. And yet, she showed up here, months later, dating my brother. Smiling. Planning. Pretending. Madison didn't interrupt. She didn't defend. She didn't cry or protest or storm out in dramatic fashion. She just sat back in her chair, legs crossed, head tilted slightly, as if watching the final scene of a play she had already seen 100 times and found mildly amusing. And then she spoke. You're not wrong, she said calmly, voice smooth and unhurried. I did know. I remembered you the moment I saw you at that first dinner. I remembered the house. I remembered everything. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My mother looked like she might faint. But I didn't come here for you, she added. I came here because Liam deserved better than the shadow of a man you once married. And maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, that I could build something from the ashes of something broken. Maybe that's cruel. Maybe it's selfish. But at least I didn't lie. The gall of it, the quiet audacity, was enough to make the room spin. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned to Liam, who stood near the doorway, his face unreadable, and I waited for something, anything. An apology. A thank you. Even just a nod. He said nothing. And that, in the end, was louder than any speech. I left shortly after. I didn't stay for the goodbye hugs or the awkward apologies or the desperate attempts to pretend things could go back to normal. There was no normal anymore. Not for me. Not for Liam. Not for Madison. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a text I almost didn't check. But curiosity, as always, won. It was from Jeremy. You didn't have to drag her into this. I stared at the words, trying to decide whether they were meant to scold me or warn me or simply remind me that some stories don't end neatly, with villains and heroes and tidy resolutions. And maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't have to drag her into it. But she walked in on her own. And I just made sure the lights were on when she did. Let the rest of them decide what to do with the wreckage. Me? I was done being quiet.